Iodo, at your service. In today's video, I'll be showing you how to make authentic looking letters and documents. So this is a bit of a different topic compared to my usual topics. However, in fantasy reenactment, LARP, D&D, whatever other hobbies you can think of in that general area, there are a huge number of applications for this kind of thing. And, as I'm hopefully going to show you, it's not as hard as you think. However, before we begin, I do have a little tiny disclaimer. And that is that none of this is going to be historically accurate. And there's one simple reason for that, and that is to do this historically accurately requires huge amounts of time, skill, experience, and mainly expensive materials. So instead of going that way, I'll be focusing on what you can do with cheap materials and materials that you probably already have. And I'll be showing you some quick tricks to make stuff look authentic, with the emphasis on the word look, without having to spend a lot of money or needing to suddenly become an amazing calligraphy artist. Okay, I've got quite a lot of stuff to go through in quite a short amount of time, so we'll start with materials. And I think the most important type of material for letters and documents is probably paper. The first type of paper is your standard printer paper, so it's quite thin. The problems with this for this kind of application is it's very, very smooth, which means that it has a very modern, well-finished look to it. However, it is possible to make it look older. What you can do is you can tear the edges, or you can tea stain it, which is basically where you just dip a tea bag in water and rub it over it and then leave it to dry, and it will make it look darker and more old. That will work. The other thing you can just do is you can just make it wet and then leave it to dry, and then it won't be perfect, it will be slightly rippled. So whilst you can do that, I don't like to do that personally, because printer paper will always look like printer paper no matter what you do to it. Just one quick note on tearing the edges of paper. So a lot of people who make fantasy documents and that will make like a completely random sort of a shape like that. And to me that's not convincing, because that's just unfinished, and somebody who makes paper can definitely cut a straight line. It doesn't really matter what your equipment is, you can cut a straight line with any sort of knife, and I don't think that that's convincing. However, paper that is hand pressed typically has a kind of slightly feathery edge, so it's not like a perfect guillotine cut edge. And what you can do is you can put a ruler on there and you can press it down, and then you can tear an edge, so it's still a straight cut edge, so it looks kind of well made and that, but it is not perfectly guillotine straight, which I think is a much more convincing fantasy document finish than this, or burnt edges, or any of the above. So that will work on any type of paper. Your next best for, I'll start from cheapest and work gradually forwards to more expensive, is actually blotting paper. Blotting paper is very cheap, and it very often isn't fully bleached, so it's sort of got that slight creamy texture to it. The only problem is, because it's blotting paper, obviously ink will spread out through it. If you're not writing with ink and you're planning to write with pencil, then you can use blotting paper, and it's got a nice stiff texture and it's got a nice feel to it, and I quite like that. One moment. Now, these have actually been used in a flower press, you know, one of these things where you squash flowers to preserve them, and you use blotting paper to dry stuff out. And because of that, it's already got that sort of not quite flat, pressed in, dimpled look to it, which is why it doesn't look brand new. And I could just use that to make a letter on, and it would look really quite nice, obviously if I'm not using ink. Next cheapest option is probably like professional art papers and stuff. So this isn't a very good example because this is bleached perfectly white, but you can get like sketchbooks and stuff which are more of a creamy texture, or ink drawing books and whatever from art shops, and they will be appropriate to write in ink on. So if you're using ink, you can go to one of these. Again, they are thicker and stiffer and have more of the look to it. This one would probably need tea staining to make it not completely white. But that is just torn out of a sketchbook like this, which was not very expensive. I think it cost me about £2 or something. And if you want to go really fancy, this isn't fancy, I bought it at a charity shop, but that's not the point. You can get professional calligraphy papers which are designed for working on with ink. But I pretty much don't normally use these unless I'm going to be using a dip pen, because they're difficult to come by ones that I like, whereas this has got a little bit of a mottled texture which makes quite a convincing document. So that's something to consider if you can get hold of it, but it's quite hard to get and you probably don't already have it. The other thing you can use, which works quite good for the tea staining effects and that, is kind of designed for watermarked letter writing papers. But I don't like these because they tend to put company logos in them, so this one's got the company's logo in. It's difficult to see. There you go, you can see that. I would steer clear of things like that, but sometimes, if you're lucky, you can come across watermarked papers which, this isn't one of them, this has got a company logo right in the middle of it, but you can see the texture in there where it's like in lines and it looks almost rolled. You can find papers like that which don't have a company logo in the middle, which are really good, but I haven't got any of those in at the moment. Next is, of course, ink. My category for ink is basically anything that you can create a line on a piece of paper with. So I'm going to start with the basics, which is pencil. So there is nothing that stands out as too modern about a line drawn in pencil. While you've got pencil, you've also got coloured pencils. So you can use black coloured pencil and that comes out with a slightly different type of line, or you can shade in areas with ordinary coloured pencils. So if you were trying to create a detail in the corner of a page, you could do something like this. If you imagine that in the corner of a page, that's just took me literally about 15 seconds to create. It doesn't really need any artistic talent, it's just a zigzag with a line on either side. So I could shade in different bits of it, in different colours, and it looks really quite convincing as a kind of fantasy document, fancy border type thing. Now you're probably thinking, oh no, I'm not very good at art, I'll never be able to do that, but this stuff is really quite simple. I mean, that shading there, it isn't skilled, it's just a scribble. But as a detailing piece in the corner of a document, if it's only small, it just adds that bit of a, this isn't a normal boring letter sort of a look to it. Pencils as a form of writing and drawing, if you haven't got any ink pens or fountain pens or roller liquid ink pens or dip pens or whatever else fancy stuff that you're seeing people use out there, you can create a beautiful piece of work just using pencil. And then if you were going to say, write your letter in pencil on top of there, it would work absolutely fine. Again, in order of what are you most likely to have and what is cheapest, what's next on the list? So in terms of not breaking immersion, we're still not going to be historically accurate. You can use these, which are like rollerball liquid ink pens. if you write in that, obviously it's going to be a lot more even than a fountain pen or a dip pen would give you, but it is still a liquid ink, and if you look at it closely, it's not like a biro or a ballpoint pen where you're going to actually see that sort of strange, slightly grey gel ink sort of lining in it. I don't think it's not easy to explain, but there's a look which looks very modern that comes from those pens. And anything you're using where when you tip the pen you can see the ink dripping from one end to the other will probably give you a line that looks nearly convincing as if it was maybe done with a fountain pen or a dip pen. You can use those. I don't see a problem with using those, especially if you're using them on a paper where it spreads out a bit, because then it sort of hides the modern look to it. And you can get these in different colours, so if you wanted to get these in black and in blue, you can do a bit of extra sort of patterny detail on the sides of your document using that. The next one up for what are you most likely to have is you might have a fountain pen. I actually don't have a fountain pen that works that I can find to do this video. However, fountain pens are great because they're basically dip pens without the hassle of having to worry about keep dipping it in a bottle of ink. And realistically, it gives the same kind of effect, and somebody looking at it wouldn't necessarily easily be able to tell if it was done with a fountain pen or with a dip pen. So, what's a dip pen? Well, I could go complicated and I could talk about different types of ends because the ends pull out of them and all kinds of things like that. But realistically, the only dip pen end I ever use is this one, which is like it's a thin standard writing point. Little bottles of ink like this you can buy from art stores in lots of different colours. People will buy the Parker one. The Parker one is fine, but I like this one because the bottle is wide bottomed so it doesn't fall over very easily, and I'm very prone to making a mess. So this stuff scares me, because if I knock one of those over on my bench it would take me literally hours to clean up, and I'd probably end up having to replace the vinyl. While you can use blotting paper for this, which I will because I've actually got some here, you can also just use a bit of tissue. I am not an expert dip pen writer, so all the stuff that I do will end up generally quite messy. And then there's the other thing is I'm now on printer paper, which spreads out about as much as blotting paper does. Because of the way that dip pens are, my writing will end up kind of more swirly. And that's just because a smooth stroke is a lot easier to draw than a straight stroke. So I'll pretty much never use these to do runes, because the equivalent in runes is kind of very difficult to do, and you get this annoying thing where the lines blur into each other and you get drips every time you lift the pen off the paper and put it back down, because our kind of joined up handwriting script which has developed on Earth is because it's easier to write with quills and dip pens and stuff. You could also look up a tutorial on how to make a feather quill out of a feather and then just dip that in there, but those are really difficult to write with, so I wouldn't recommend it. There's any number of stuff you could do with this. Another bit of equipment that you're going to need if you're using dip pens and you're changing colour is you're going to need a little pot of water and a tissue, unless you have the luxury of like enough nibs to switch colour without ever cross-contaminating, because you don't want to dip a pen with black ink on in the pot of blue ink, because that will result in you having two pots of bluey black ink. Now, if I dip that in there, the water will instantly go black because all the ink has dissolved, and then I can just dry it off in the tissue. And whilst it's not 100% perfect, it mostly works, and now I can use the blue. I don't know if that's what you're supposed to do, but it's what I do. Okay, so what about additional equipment? Well, the additional equipment side of things is pretty much completely covered by ruler, rubber, lighter gauge pencils or just pencils where you can do guidelines. So if you're writing in ink and you want either guidelines on your paper or you want to draft stuff, you can just write really faintly like that. And then you can go over it in ink. And on a different note, if you're lucky enough to have a light box or a bright enough torch and a piece of glass to shine through, you can actually illuminate your paper from underneath. You can do your draft on a scrap piece of paper. Then you can put your new piece of paper on top and you can use that. But you can also use guidelines. Guidelines are basically... I'll have the light back. Guidelines are basically a piece of paper with hard lines drawn on it, which is very dark, which you can actually see through most types of paper, and you can see them well enough to follow, so it keeps all your lines straight. You can use them. You can also make them. If you get a standard ruled piece of paper out of an ordinary notebook with lines in it, and you go over them in a thick felt pen, then you can then just put your paper on top and see it through and use that. Guidelines are great. I never don't use a set of guidelines. A lot of you are going to ask in the comments if I don't mention it. What about wax seals? Wax seals are a kind of given for fantasy documents and they're great. This is a gift that I received from somebody a few years ago. It's just printed on printer paper, but it's sealed with a wax seal and it's folded beautifully and it makes it look really the part. I don't have equipment to do wax seals. It's not very expensive and it can be obtained from eBay, and there are hundreds of videos on YouTube showing you how to do it. But I don't have it, so I can't show you, and it's something I would like to get at some point. But if you want to get hold of that and use it, go for it. It's not expensive. So what about fonts and languages and stuff? So in fantasy you get all kinds of different languages, and then you see all of these fancy documents with swirly writing and gothic characters and whatever. So we'll start with font. Now you've already seen this example that I just kind of drew when I was talking about pens. So the dip pen one will look kind of posh, especially to someone who doesn't have the neatest of handwriting, and I understand this fully because my handwriting is normally a mess. But don't worry about that, because if you've produced a well handwritten letter laid out nicely with straight lines and everything, if your handwriting's a bit of a mess, it's still gonna look great, especially if you add like details and things on the side. So what would I do about font? The first thing is, don't think you have to become an expert in calligraphy and learn all this kind of thing, because while I have this book, it cost me £1 in Age UK, I've never used it. What I do instead is I just write. And very often it is perfectly possible to change your handwriting based on what you're doing. So if I was writing a wanted poster written by some kind of crime gang for a D&D campaign or something, I would probably think, oh, the writing's bound to be messy and scratchy and all over the place. But if I was writing something that was maybe written by a Hobbit who is probably quite skilled in the art of writing letters, because hobbits like that kind of thing, then I might think, oh, I'm going to try and do this a bit more neatly. So what I'd normally do is I'd sit down and I'd think, well, what style am I going to use? Is it going to be swirly? Is it going to have massive loops? And then I would write a lowercase alphabet out. So perhaps and then I'd pay particular attention to letters like G and Y, where I might do that, and then I'll just leave that on the desk on a scrap piece of paper and I'll try and keep it consistent. So whilst you aren't going to be able to get every single letter consistent because it will naturally lean towards looking like your kind of handwriting, what you can do is, if you decide you want all the letters with loops on to have a loop like that, then you just make sure you do that and it'll come out and it'll look a different style. So you can actually create changes in your own handwriting to make it fit a kind of a style which would be attached to the character that this is supposed to come from, even if your handwriting is messy, so don't be afraid of that. The next big question is going to be languages. It's fantasy. You're going to get runic scripts. You're going to get Elvish, which I haven't got an example of, or even perhaps something that was written by an orc. What do you do about that? For those of you who don't know, these aren't written languages. There's no new words unless you want to do that, which I don't because I'm really bad at that kind of language. These are scripts, which means that you have a translation for every letter. You've got different letters and a symbol for each letter of the alphabet, and that allows you to write in something else. Now, I will put a link in the description of this video to the Wikipedia article on Dwarvish Cirth, which is what essentially the Dwarvish runes would be in Lord of the Rings. There is any number of different places where you can get this stuff from, depending on what your project is, of course. So this is the D&D Player's Handbook for 5e. On page 123, there is a Dwarvish script and an Elvish script. So depending on what style you want to go for, you can use these. You can pull things off the internet. You can get things from Lord of the Rings. You can use whatever you like. But one thing that I will say as a word of caution: if you are writing a letter to somebody else who cannot read this or might not actually know what it is you've written it in, or if you've invented your own, won't ever be able to read this, you know, don't write the entire letter in it. Just write the letter, and if the letter is coming from a dwarvish character, write kind of maybe 3/4 of it or most of it in common script, which is like ABC, and then put runes in, like maybe one sentence in the middle in runes. That is unless you want to really annoy someone or you're giving it to someone who you know likes a puzzle. You guys have already seen quite a lot of my examples, probably all of the examples that I've currently got. The problem with letters is, of course, that you send them to people, which means I don't actually have any letters that I've made myself. I have letters other people have sent to me. So we'll go back to this one, the runic one. This is an absolutely beautiful example. It's 2-pager, it's got art and everything. Now, you don't have to be an amazing artist to do details around the edges like I showed you before. But in terms of actual, I suppose, technology that he's used to make this, I don't know what the paper is, but it's tea stained and it's quite thick. It's probably like an art paper or a sketchbook paper or something. And it's all done in pencil. There isn't any ink anywhere on it, but it looks amazing anyway. And like I say, he is a very skilled artist and it shows. So the only other thing that I'm going to show you on this example is envelopes. Modern envelopes are obviously modern, and if you want to put your letter in something, this works amazingly. This is just a piece of letter paper which has been folded over like that, which the letter goes inside, and then the ends are folded over on that. If it's stiff enough, you can tie it with like a hemp string or something. I have recently taken to scanning things, so I have actually got some stuff I can show you. That is like a quick runic note that you would include with a gift or something. So that is just a piece of like blotting paper, I think, which I've written runes on in pencil. It's probably about 10 minutes work, and for what it is, it looks really quite good. This one, it looks a lot more scary and complicated, but it is only drawn with a liquid ink rollerball pen. It doesn't use any complicated pens or dip pens or fountain pens or anything at all. It's only drawn in black ink, and I've used that technique where you rip the edge of the paper, and that is the paper that I was talking about before, the ridge watermarked, which doesn't have a logo in it. And the border is just line work. And another point to mention when looking at this if you're making a fantasy document, it goes a long way to make it look more fantasy to use a non-standard aspect ratio. Okay, so you saw the runic letter with all the artwork on that was in the folded envelope before. This was my reply to it, so I kind of mostly copied his style in the way that he has done all of his artwork and stuff. This one, all of the runes are written in pencil apart from the title and all of the artwork. And the reason I did that was simply because it's a massive amount of runes to write. And I would be lying if I told you I could do that much runes without making a mistake. And the beauty of pencil is you can rub it out and you can do it again. This was done on a calligraphy paper using guidelines. It is fully in dip pen. Again, just a bit of border has been added to make it look a little bit more special than just a letter. I like to do that, but you don't have to. Without any of that border, it would still be great. This last one, it deliberately doesn't have any of the border or any of the line work around the edge, because I didn't think it was like in keeping with the style. So this one was intended to be written by a Hobbit to a ranger. Honestly, that came out 100 times better than I ever thought it would, because it is just a written letter. And I think that the reason that that one looks so convincing is because I deliberately squashed up the gap between the lines a lot, so it looks more dense. And that kind of makes it look more professional and less like it was drawn as a prop piece or something. Makes it look more real. The only thing that dip pens give you that the rollerball liquid ink pens don't is the ability to spill ink. I actually made a mistake where the name is written at the top. I can't remember what it was I did, but I remember thinking, oh no, how do I hide that, and deliberately spilling ink. I think it's about time I actually made something for this video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a fairly simple letter. It's going to be to a made-up character whose name is May G, who is a Hobbit bounder who lives in the Shire. It's going to be a very simple, quick little letter, I hope. Now, I've done what I normally do, which is I've drafted the letter in a word processor, which I can see on the screen right now, and that enables me to be able to hopefully get most of the spellings right. Firstly, I'm using blotting paper. I said earlier that the blotting paper didn't work with ink because it spreads out. I tried it and it turns out you can actually use the rollerball pens with blotting paper and it works kind of just fine. So that's what I'm going to be doing. You can't see it on the back, so it's not a problem. What I think I'll first do is I'll tear off the edges so that it doesn't look like a perfectly guillotine cut modern piece of paper. And I'm going to tear quite a big strip off one edge so that it doesn't look like a shop bought size, like I said earlier. What next? Earlier I did this as a border. I'm going to add one of those at the top corner there, and I'm going to add it there. So we'll do that first. Before I did that border, I just did it completely freehand. I think it would work better if I did it with a ruler this time. So I'm going to make sure it's the same length on both sides. So I'm going to put a 3-inch line there, and I'm going to put a 3-inch line there. And I am going to make sure that the little bit in the middle is actually square. So I'm just going to use the width of the ruler because that seemed a fairly simple cheat. And I'm going to mark out exactly the same thing at the other end. Now I'm going to start to form the zigzag thing that I've done there. So I've got like 1, 2, 3. So come down to there and another one. Now I've repeated that on both sides, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use the black pencil and I'm going to go over all of the lines that I want to keep, and the lines that are faint can just be faint, and because they're so faint I can leave them and it won't really show. So now I've created my initial border. I think I'm going to stick with the orange and blue colour scheme because I quite liked that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to shade those in quickly. What I'm aiming for here is, because I'm trying to make it look dwarvish, I'm trying to make it look angular. So straight lines are good for that because runes are in straight lines and it sort of seems right for the aesthetic. So what my next step is I'm actually going to draft out my letter in pencil. That took me about 10 minutes to draft, a full page of text. Now, it's worth noting that anything you handwrite, especially anything you handwrite in an attempted neat way or with borders around the edges so it takes up more space, or particularly in runes, is much bigger than it will ever appear on a computer screen, even in quite a large font. So this, just on the computer screen, looks like a couple of sentences really, even though it's filled this piece of paper. The bit I've written in runes at the bottom, that is essentially one very short sentence and it fills up a huge amount of space. So that's another thing to consider. If you want it to fit on the piece of paper, keep it short. Whilst I was doing this and I was thinking about keeping the angular handwriting style with gaps in and everything, you can't really see on the draft, but I ended up developing a kind of tall, thin lettering which looks kind of like it's written by someone who's used to runes. And you do develop the handwriting if you try to write differently, and so it might be worth just having a practice on a different piece of paper so that the beginning doesn't look different to the end. Now, the only other thing to note is it didn't matter what I did, I couldn't see the guidelines through blotting paper because it's really thick. So I have had to use a light box. If you don't have a light box, you can use a computer screen with a piece of plastic to stop you damaging it across it, showing white, or you can use a piece of glass with a torch behind, or you can use a window at daytime. There's any number of things that you can do. You don't need one of these. So I think what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go over this in ink using the thicker of the liquid ink pens. This is something to note as well, particularly if you're left-handed, because as you write, you're rubbing what you've already written, and if you're working in pencil or you're working in ink or there's a border, that you can damage what you've already made. So what I would recommend is you just put any other random piece of paper on top of it, and then you're not doing that. Okay, so I've now inked the entire thing. Overall, I think I corrected 2 mistakes I made in the letter between the pencil and the pen, so it was definitely worth not freehanding it. There was a spelling mistake in there somewhere, there's probably still some of those, and one of the runes was wrong in here, and I'd done an E rune instead of an M rune. They're nearly the same, that's very easy. So what I'm going to do now is, it's blotting paper, so it's very soft, so it's quite hard to take the pencil off. But you can if you're really careful, because this is what I worked out on the other sheet. So I'm just going to go over it really gently so that you can't see as many pencil lines. So now I've taken off all of the pencil lines. The rubber has taken off some of the ink in places, but that just kind of makes it look road worn, so I'm actually happy with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully fold it into thirds. I could make an envelope for it, like out of a folded separate piece of paper, but I haven't got a folded separate piece of paper, so I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to fold it into thirds-ish, and then I'm going to address it I'm going to put Meiji, Bounder of the Shire, on here, and I am going to put Shire in Dwarvish runes as well, assuming that it's going to be carried by multiple messengers in between Erebor and the Shire. So same again, draft it in pencil and then use pen. So I've put Meiji, Bounder of the Shire, and then I've addressed it in runes for any dwarves who carry this, with Shire and then Hobbiton. And then all I would need to do to make this into the perfect Middle-earth appropriate letter would be to wrap a piece of twine around the outside of that and tie it. And there we have it, a Middle-earth appropriate letter written from Erebor to the Shire. Okay guys, so that's just about it for today. I hope that was useful to you, and I'll see you in the next video.